Today's daf Bez Hashem is Masechta Zevachim Daf Samach Aleph 61. So we will begin on Daf Samach Beis by about 8 lines from the bottom. Kisolik Ravin Amr Lishmaitza. So in the previous Gemara we learned a statement from Abaya. Abaya says that Rab Loza commented, "Mizbeach shenok nifgam." Let's say the mizbeach got damaged, whatever reason, something it broke, and therefore it's not kosher. So Rab Loza said that you can't eat there no more. You can't eat on shiare mincha and kodesh kadashim. Any chatas, it's possible to eat because the mizbeach has to be in place, totally usable, and only then can you eat their kache kache. So that is the opinion that we saw for Reb Lazar. But comes along Abaye and says not only that, but even kache kalim. In other words, kachim that you eat in Yerushalayim, let's say a carbon shlamim, a carbon pesach, all that, a carbon taida, all that which is kachin kalim, if the mizbeach was damaged and you have the meat, you're not allowed to eat it. They should send you a text that you should stop eating it because it could only be eaten when the mizbeach is intact. That was the chiddush of Abaya. And it was based on a statement of Rabbi Yishmael, who said that you compare the meat of the bechor to the blood of the bechor, which was, let's say the Gemara was talking about a bechor, a very interesting case, that the bechor, they shechted a bechor, they sprinkled the blood on the mizbeach, and then they destroyed the Beis Hamikdash. Can you eat that bechor if you're still within the day of the mizbeach destruction? So Rabbi Shmuel says no. Even though they sprinkled the blood on the mizbeach, and the meat is still intact, you're not allowed to eat it because the mizbeach was destroyed. The Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. So we compare the meat to the blood. There's a hekesh between the meat and the blood. Just like the blood had to be only as kosher when the mizbeach is around, so the meat is also only kosher. You can only eat the meat when the mizbeach is around. So bottom line is, Rabbias made a statement that kachim kalim, if the mizbeach is not usable, if it's broken, then one cannot eat kachim kalim. So we go to the Gemara, 8 lines from the bottom of Samach Beis. Kisolik Ravin Amra Lishmaitza Kamei Rav Yirmiyah. When Ravin went up, I guess, to Eretz Yisrael, and he said over the statement of Abaya in front of Rabbi Yirmiyah that kachi kalim, once the mizbeach is broken, damaged, then one cannot eat kachin kalim anymore. Amra, he said, Rabbi Yirmiyah said, Bavloi tipshoi. The Babylonians, which is Abaya, is fools. Amtul yasru ba'ar d'chashuchi, because they live in a land that's dark. Amri shmaitz the mechashcha. They're saying dark statements. In other words, Rabbiya is completely wrong. Kachi kalim, according to Rabbi Yirmiyah, you are allowed to eat even though the mizbeach is not intact, because lo shemiya lo didn't Abaye here. Hadetanya, the following brisa, the Sefta in Masechta Kela, b'shach silik masois, when they would dismantle the Mishkan during the travels in the desert. So then, let's say a person has kachim at that time, kachim nisalim, he's not allowed to eat the kachim. But vizavim, and so now who is, after they dismantled the Mishkan, the Mishkan as a dismantled construction was in the possession of the Machne Leviah. The Machne Leviim would carry the Mishkan. So therefore, vizavim umitzurayim mishtalchim chutz lemechitza. The Zavim and Mitzayris cannot be in that vicinity. In other words, even a Zav, who technically can be in Machne Yisrael, Mitzayra has to be thrown out of Klal Yisrael, out of the three Machnes. But if Zav, you would think that since there's no Mishkan, because it's you're on the move, they're allowed to hang around the Levium. No, they're not allowed to be there. They have to be out the Mechitza, because at the end of the day, even though they're carrying the Mishkan, it's still a Mishkan. And therefore, it's still considered an oil moed. Yet, if that's the case, still, even though they're carrying the Mizbeach and they're moving it from place to place, you're not allowed to eat kachim. That's what the Brisa says. So this, we're going to assume that this Brisa is talking about kache kachim. Tanya, we learned in a Brisa of Tanya Idich, and another Brisa we learned that on b'shnei mekaymis kachim nechalim, that one could eat kachim when in two places, whether the Mishkan is intact, whether Mishkan is not intact. So here, the second brisa says you could eat kachim when the Mishkan's on the move. The first brisa says you can't eat kachim when the Mishkan's on the move. My love. So we see what's the difference. Ha b'kachim kachim. Kachim, like a chatos, when the Mishkan's on the move and the Mizbeach is not there, you can't eat kachim. Ha, but where we say that you could eat kachim, because it's independent whether Mizbeach is in place or not. But kachim kalam, when it's kachim kalam, you could always eat kachim kalam. So this is a question against the Baya. Baya said that when kachim kalam, when the Mizbeach has a damage, so it's not there, or it's not usable, one cannot eat kachim kalam. And this Brisa says that even when they were traveling in the desert and the Mizbeach was on the move, you're allowed to eat kachim kalam, kachim necholim. That's how we talk about the Brises. Answers the Gemara, Amar Ravina. Ravina said, Idi v'idi b'kachim kalam. They're both talking about kachim kalam, v'loy kacha. V'loy kasha. And I'm not going to have a question against one brisa and the other. And in fact, I can say that the first brisa that says kachim nifsalin is talking about kachim kalam. And the second brisa that says you could eat kachim kalam, it's necholim, is also talking about kachim kalam. And Abaya will go like the first brisa, but kasha, it's not difficult. We go to Amid Aleph. Ha Rabbi Shmuel, ha Rabbanan. The first brisa goes according to Rabbi Shmuel, who had a hekesh, which that is who's Abaya hanging his hat on. He's hanging his hat on this Tana, who clearly says that kachin kalam, one is not allowed to eat when there is no mizbeach intact. And that's how Abaya went with. That was the opinion of Abaya. Ha, Rabbanim. But the second brisa that says you could eat kachim kalim goes according to Rabbanim, where there is no hekesh, and they don't hold of that hekesh, and therefore kachim kalim could be eaten even though the mizbeach is dismantled. The Gemara says, "V'ibayasem." If you want, I can tell you. Hava kachim kachim. I could say both brises. The first brisa that says you can't eat kachim kachim. Second brisa is saying you could eat kachim kachim, and they're both talking about kachim kachim. Oh my b'shnei mekaymis. What does it mean? You can eat kachim kachim when the base mizbeach is on the move? No, it doesn't mean that the mizbeach is on the move. When the Brisa says shnei mekaymis, there are two possibilities to eat kachim kachim. Is koidim shiam de leviim mikdash. When the Levium stood up the Mishkan and it's normal, and the Mishkan was in place with the curtains around and everything was set up, so then for sure you can eat kachim kachim. But the Brisa teaches you Amid Beis when they took apart the Mishkan and the Mizbeach is still in place, but there is no curtain around there. In other words, they're on their way, they're halfway packed, so they took down all the curtains of the Chatzer. They took down all the curtains of the Chatzer, and they're just about to put everything away and start the move. So there, since the Mizbeach is still in its place, even though it doesn't have curtains around it, you could eat kachim kachim. And that's what the Brisa is not talking about kachim kalim. And what's the chiddush? Mahu, the same I would have thought, if seluhu b'yaitse, that this, once you took down the curtains of the Mishkan, then even though the Mizbeach is still in place, you can't eat there because there's no confined area anymore because there's no mechitza around there. Kamash Malan, that's what the Brisa says. But as long as you didn't move the Mishkan, you could still eat kachim kalim. Says the Gemara, maybe, how do you know that? How do you know that if you took down the curtain, it's now the Mizbeach loses its status where you could eat the kachim around there? Hamakra, because the pasuk says, "V'nasa oil moed," you could carry the Mishkan. Afal pishanasa, even though you're about to carry it, oil moed, it's still considered the Mishkan. So despite the fact that you took down the curtains of the Chatzir, since you didn't start moving the Mizbeach, it's still considered that you're in the vicinity of the Mishkan, the oil moed, and therefore you could eat kachi kachim, and that's what the Bryce is. Nu Gemara. Amar Rav Huna Amar Rav. Rav Huna said in the name of Rav, Mizbeach shel Shiloh shel Avanim Hoya. The Mizbeach of Shiloh was made out of stone. Was made out of stone. In other words, I think Moshe made his Mizbeach out of copper. But here, once they settled in Mizbeach and they came to Shiloh, they built a new Mizbeach. And this new Mizbeach was made out of stone. The Tanya, we learned in the Brisa, Rablezer ben Yaakov Oima, Mal Talmud Loima, why does the Pasuk say, Avonim, 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 Sholish Palmim? It says that in the Pasuk 3 times, if you're going to make a Mizbeach, 3 times in the Torah, it says if you make the Mizbeach out of stone, do this, do that. So the Torah does indicate that Mizbeach was made out of stone. So yes, in the Mishkan it was made out of copper, but in the Echad Shashiloi, Echad Shanoi Begivim, Beis Elam, during those 3 periods of time, I guess they built new base in Shiloh. When the Mishkan was in Shiloh, they built the Mizbeach out of stone. When they moved the Mishkan to Noiv and Givoin, it was also made out of stone. Ubeis Olamin, and when Shlomo HaMelech built the Beis HaMikdash, he made it also out of stone. So that was, let me just see, yeah. So the Pasuk says, Mizbeach Avonim Leisonif, Avonim Shleim Stivna, Mizbeach Avonim. So 3 times it says. So now the Gemara asks a question. Mosiv Rav Acha Bar Ami, Eish Shiyordu Min HaShemayim. The fire that came down from Shemayim b'mei Moshe. Moshe had a Mizbeach, and somehow Hashem made a magic fire, lahavdil, a holy fire, I should say, that came down from Shemayim to help burn the kachim. And it stayed. It didn't extinguish. It did not remove itself from the copper mizbeach until Shlomo built his mizbeach. So we see that they continued to use the mizbeach hanachoshech up until the building of the first Beis HaMikdash. So how could you say that they built a stone mizbeach in Shiloh when they had this Kedusha fire that came down from Shemayim that continued to burn on the Mizbeach HaNachoshes until Shlomo built his Mizbeach. And now Shlomo built a new Mizbeach. The Brisa continues, Ve'esh yarda b'mei Shlomo, that fire that came down during the times of Shlomo, did not extinguish until Menashe extinguished it. He was a big Rasha. But there was a fire that came down when Shlomo built the Beis HaMikdash and he built a new Mizbeach. A fire came down, and burnt and lit up the Mizbeach that Shlomo built, but did not extinguish until Menashe, many years later, who was an evil king. Then the fire got extinguished. Then Isa, if it's true that they built a new Mizbeach in Shiloh made out of stone, right? So then Mi'ikaru is Stalaklet. Then when they built that new Mizbeach in Shiloh, then the fire that was on Moshe Rabbeinu's copper Mizbeach should have been extinguished. Answers the Gemara, Hu da'amak Rab Nasan. Rav Huna said like Rav Nasan. The Tanya renewed in the Brisa. You could also say he goes like Rablezer ben Yaakov that says that the Mizbeach was made out of stone and Shiloh, so that you can have a Tana. But the Gemara even finds another Tana. Here he says it clearer. Mizbeach shel Shiloh shel nechoshes haya. The Mizbeach of Shiloh was made out of choshes, of copper, hollow, umale avonim was full of stones. So it was made full of stones. So therefore, that's the teretz. We found a Tana that basically Rav could hang his hat on. So you see, because you could also say Rav Huna, Rav went like Rav Lezer ben Yaakov, but maybe Rav Lezer ben Yaakov is saying that it was kosher to use stones in Shiloh, but maybe they kept Moshe Rabbeinu's Mizbeach around. But for Rabbi Nosson, he says they built a new Mizbeach. They built it of copper, and it was hollow, and they filled it up with stones. Rav Nachman by Yitzchak Amar, Rav Yachma Yitzchak has another teretz to this brisa. My loy nistalka, it means loy nistalka levad tola. That means in other words, yes, in Shiloh they built a new mizbeach made out of stone. Fine. But they kept Moshe Rabbeinu's mizbeach still there in existence. That's what it means. It was still, I don't know, there was a side by side. So Mahi, what does that mean? Rav Bianan Amar Rabbanim says Shaviva Hav Meshadra. When they would makter, when they would use the new mizbeach during the time of Shiloh, there was like fire coming from the mizbeach of Moshe, the copper mizbeach, and falling onto the fire, falling onto the mizbeach, the new mizbeach. So that's the in other words, they didn't totally get rid of Moshe Rabbeinu's nechoshes mizbeach when they built Shiloh. So that's what Nachman Yitzchak says. Rapapa explains. Rabbanan explained Rab Nachman Yitzchak. Rab Papa explains, I think, Rab Nachman Yitzchak, Ishpiza Hava Nakat, in other words, Moshe Rabbeinu's Mizbeach was still intact. And sometimes they use the Mishkan, the new Mishkan, and the new Mizbeach, and sometimes they use the old Mizbeach. So that's what it means. That the fire that came down from Shemaim Moshe Rabbeinu's Mizbeach was still in operation during Mishkan Shiloh, although in Mishkan Shiloh they built a new Mizbeach that had like a backup Mizbeach, and sometimes they used Moshe Rabbeinu's Mizbeach, and sometimes they used the new Mizbeach. Tanan Hasan, we learned over there, Olu b'nei hagoyla, hasifa alav dalar amis min hadaram v'dalar amis min marav kimin goma. When they built the second base of Migdash, they extended the Mizbeach to be 32 amas by 32 amas. My tama, what's the reason? In the second base of Migdash, they built the Mizbeach bigger than they had it in the first base of Migdash. So the Gemara wants to know, what's the reason for that? Amar Rav Yosef says, Mishum Deloy Safik, because the second base of Migdash, they brought more karbanos, and therefore it wasn't enough to accommodate such a smaller Mizbeach, so they extended the Mizbeach that they existed in the first base of Migdash. Amalei Abaya, so Abaya says, what do you mean? There was more people around in Eretz Yisrael during the first base of Migdash, and they brought more karbanos. Hashta Migdash Rishon, during the first base of Migdash, the base of Migdash, it says, Yehuda of Yisrael, Rabin, Kachoy, Lashal, Sfasa Yom. There were so many Jews there, like sands by the ocean. Sapak. So they had the Mizbeach, the smaller Mizbeach, was enough to accommodate all the karbonos. Migdasheni, by the base of Migdash, second base of Migdash, the Ksiv it says in the Pasuk, Kol HaKol, Ke'echad Arbar Riboy, was like maybe 40,000 people, 4 times 10,000 people. Loisipek, so they didn't have it, the Mizbeach wasn't enough. I mean, they had less people by the second base of Migdash. So the question is, why did they extend it? They extend the Mizbeach from the first base of Migdash. That was a question of Abaya. So Amalei, so Rabbi Yosef answered Abaya, Hossam, Eish Shel Shemayim Mesayatan. They had this powerful fire, a heavenly fire, in the first base of Migdash, and that helped consume, despite the fact there were more people, it helped consume all the karbanos on the Mizbeach. But the second base of Migdash, they didn't have any fire from heaven. So they didn't have the fire of heaven to help burn the karbanos. And because of that, therefore, they relied more on natural fire, and in order to accommodate, they had to extend the Mizbeach. That's the first teretz. Now we're giving another teretz why they extended the Mizbeach of the second base of Migdash. And basically what the Gemara is going to say over here, like you see in the picture, they extended the second base of Migdash to make a drain where they can do Nisach Hayayin and Nisach Hamayim, which went through a tunnel, basically a pipe, in the Mizbeach to the ground. You see, they didn't have that in the first base of Migdash. In other words, it wasn't hollow in the first base of Migdash. So the Gemara explains like this. He also Ravin Omar Rab Shimon ben Pazi Mishum Bakapara Shitin Haisifu. They added these drains into the Mizbeach so they can pour the wine and the water. Mikara Savar, during the time Shlomo Melech thought Mizbeach Adama, that you have to make a Mizbeach made out of the ground. Shu Otam Adama, it has to be totally full of earth. So there was no pipe within his Mizbeach. And therefore, when they did Nisach HaMayim and Nisach HaYayim, they poured it on the side of the Mizbeach and landed into a pit on the side of the Mizbeach, but they didn't pour it in the Mizbeach. Saif Savar, in the end, they held that no, by the second base of English, they held maybe Shlomo had it wrong. Shtia Kachila. You have to have the drinking that Hashem does like he eats. And so therefore, just like the eating is inside the Mizbeach, so also the drinking that Hashem does, so to speak, with these Nisach HaYayin and Nisach HaMayim, that has to be in the Mizbeach, that the water and the wine have to go into a pipe in the Mizbeach. And the Mizbeach was hollow in parts of it. And what does it mean, my Mizbeach Adam? But the Torah says the Mizbeach have to be made out of ground. Shuhu mechuba ba'adam, it's connected to the ground. You cannot build the Mizbeach on top of a hall or some studs on top of a tunnel. In other words, it had to be really secured, connected to the ground, albeit it could be hollow, and therefore that's why they extended the Mizbeach to accommodate this new idea of being able to pour a wine and water within the Mizbeach. So ends Daf Samach Aleph. Have a good Shabbos.